Hi, it's James with Cowboy 43 Productions here, and I'm making a video where I share some of my thoughts on atheism, Part 3. So in previous videos, we went over the definition of atheism. We covered the history of atheism. We covered some of my testimony, and then we also went into why people doubt. So there's two types of doubt that we really wrestle with. There is emotional doubt, which is a big one. I feel this way. This does or doesn't fit my agenda. People simply hate it when you talk about sin and salvation. Like, oh my gosh, I'm not an atheist because I just want to sin.
I'm still willing to admit that it's inspired and that God exists and all of it's all connected. But I remember flipping that switch and being like, yeah, the Bible is human, and there's things in it that are not correct. And how do we know? How do we know that we can trust all of these stories and the details in them?
Then you have intellectual doubt. People have their belief, and then they look into it and they realize the reasons why they believed what they believed are not actually as good as they first thought. You know, I'm worshiping this weird spaghetti monster or something. And it's like, you know, do I ever even see a spaghetti monster flying through the sky? Or is this more of just a figment of my imagination? Or my friends and family, their imagination? Wait a minute. The Bible can get things wrong?
A lot of say, well, atheists leave Christianity because you want to go sin or because you haven't read enough books.
Yeah, that's both. Those are both tropes that I've talked about a lot. Yeah.
And I did nothing but order Christian books. Mm-hmm. I was just reading everything I could to try to hold on because it was my whole life.
So I personally use the term wrestle with unbelief because I don't find that most people want to give up their God belief. I think they find that they want to believe, but the evidence is just so stacked against their God belief. And in the end, they just have no choice but to give up their faith.
Like before I became an atheist, I was a very reluctant atheist. I didn't want to leave my faith. I didn't want to leave, my core beliefs, my identity behind. And so I made this transition where I stopped believing in hell. And then I was more of a liberal old earth creationist and then more of a deist and then eventually just gave it up.
You have one of the videos with Alex, the cosmic skeptic. And in the video, he talks about his deconstruction. And he says how I deconstructed my faith until eventually I had no faith left. And so for him, there's really not a lot of good God arguments that push him over the fence to becoming a theist.
It does seem clear that sometimes people can hold to positions unreasonably, to put it mildly. That is to say, maybe if God does exist and does make his existence apparent to everybody, there are some people who simply won't accept it, even if it's obvious to them. Now, this would be an example of unreasonable disbelief in God, because you're given enough reason to believe in God, but you still reject him anyway. This, I think everybody would agree, is unreasonable, and wouldn't be a problem for Christianity. If it were the case that God really did give us enough evidence of his existence, and people rejected that evidence in an unreasonable fashion, then that's not God's fault. That would be our fault. However, there does seem to be this other category of disbelief, called reasonable disbelief. It's sometimes also called non-resistant non-belief. That is, somebody isn't convinced by evidence, doesn't believe in God's existence, not because they're being unreasonable or rejecting what should be sufficient evidence, but genuinely, honestly, they're just not convinced. Maybe this is the kind of person who actually wants to believe in God. I would count myself among that category. I think it would be fantastic if Christianity were true, if there were a God who really loved us and really did die for our sins. I think that would be wonderful for me. But I just don't believe that it's the case, and I don't find it convincing. And I think that this kind of interaction, honestly engaging with the arguments, at least as honestly as I'm capable of doing so, is an example of considering converting back to Christianity.
There's actually been a lot of agnostics over the centuries who have attempted to take down Christianity, and they've really wrestled with it, and they've ended up coming out as theists. And then you've got a lot of atheists, really just for different reasons. They find that the evidence is stacked against Christianity. I even knew a guy he's a camp counselor, and he told me when he was younger, he was trying to make himself an atheist, and so he was studying all this atheist material, and he was really digging into it, and things started to change for him. He said, whoa, I'm going down the wrong path trying to become an atheist. And so he made this switch and he became a theist, he became a Christian. And he's been on that road ever since. And that was something he really brought to me. Like, he was intentionally looking to try to become an atheist. One way we can wrestle with emotional doubt, there's an author, Gary Chapman, and he makes several books on the 5 love languages. You know, we each have these emotional love languages. Some people have physical touch, some people have words of affirmation, some people have acts of service. And we can actually wrestle with our relationships with one another, and we can struggle emotionally and just tend to act out quite a bit, especially as teenagers and young adults, because our love language just isn't being met, and we want people to feed into us in a positive way. And so people can end up wrestling with God's existence and doubt because they're wrestling with their love language, their emotional needs not being met in some way. And they can do all types of crazy things to try to fill that emotional void in their lives. So with all that, what are the best arguments against God?
Let's see. Our colonies are blown to hell, the Covenant have found Earth, and our last best hope is a guy in green metal underoos with serious friendly fire issues. I'm great!
So one of the most common arguments against God deals with suffering. People will ask, where is God in the midst of suffering? Why does God allow suffering in the world? Is it because he doesn't exist? So then people will typically say, well, I can't, and people will typically say, I can't believe in a God who allows suffering. If God was all powerful and all loving, he would just wipe the suffering out. I wouldn't suffer at all. Never. It's just a simple cause and effect relationship. So one common response people have is, well, God allows suffering because he uses it to create something better. And then people will say, I don't believe in a God, I can't believe in a God who allows suffering and then uses it for his glory. Many Jewish people will often refer to themselves as spiritual but not religious, and when asked why, they'll cite some of the horrible suffering that's occurred amongst the Jewish people throughout the centuries. Up from the Exodus all the way to the time of Jesus, there was a lot of suffering, just with different culture groups that were looking to get the Jewish people. And then with the followers of Jesus, things really didn't get that much better. There's been many years of persecution and suffering that has occurred. I would ask, why do people call themselves followers of a faith? Why are we more likely to pull our cell phones out and record someone on our cell phone than to go get help or to help out in some way? Why is there such a strong bystander effect? I think oftentimes we throw ourselves under the bus. There's situations that we could really take action to prevent or do better with, and we don't.
1755, I think, was the year. If I'm off by like 3 years. Lisbon, Portugal, one of the holiest cities in all of Europe. A Catholic city. All Saints' Day, one of the holier days in the Christian calendar, back then especially. Everyone was in church, worshiping. That morning, there was an earthquake. And that earthquake, what buildings are most susceptible to earthquakes? The tallest, biggest buildings. And this is 1755. What are the tallest, biggest buildings in Lisbon? The churches. So, that morning, 80,000 people died in their churches from the collapse of the domes, the walls, and what followed the earthquake? Guess what? A tsunami followed the earthquake, basically wiping the city of Lisbon clean. Okay, that was the beginning of what we today think of as the modern atheism. Because at the time people said, if God is all loving, how could he have possibly done this? God presumably controlling the forces of nature. We're not talking about man's inhumanity to man here, which would be the consequence of free will. We're talking about nature. And so people at the time, led by people such as Voltaire, asked the question, if there is a God, and we had this tsunami that killed 80,000 people and wiped out a holy city on a holy day, collapsing churches onto people's heads, then either God is not all powerful, or God is not all good. If we define good by being interested in your health and longevity, that's a fair definition of being good, I would think. And so that created an entire philosophical rift in the theological community, and people parted ways at that time. So when I look at the universe and I see asteroids coming down to strike and rendering species extinct, I see forces of nature that would just as soon have us dead or extinct. I don't see the goodness in the world that people speak of.
Another argument against God deals with just the hidden nature of God. You know, God allows suffering, but then he also has his reasons why he hides from us. God is not apparently visible to us all the time in ways that are overwhelmingly obvious. You know, you see the mailman come up to your front door and put the mail in the slot and wave to you and then disappear, so you know why the mail is there. But you don't see God creating the heavens and the earth. They've just always kind of been here. You know, you don't see God creating new species. All the species that we have on Earth have always just kind of been there.
Firstly, it may be that this God simply doesn't exist. This is the conclusion of the atheist, and this is the conclusion of the divine hiddenness argument. It seeks to establish that conclusion. God doesn't exist. That explains this situation. A second conclusion that we could take is that this God does exist, but isn't a loving God. Or maybe his loving character is of the kind of quality that means that even if there are people who want to be in a relationship with him, for some reason he willingly denies them. The third conclusion that we can take is that actually God is there and is perfectly loving and will let anybody who truly seeks him enter into a relationship with him. It's just that anybody who claims that they are reasonably disbelieving but doesn't find God is actually not reasonably disbelieving. They're doing something wrong. They're actually not being reasonable in their assessment of the evidence, in other words. I think serious philosophical approach to this question will focus on the second of these options. Is God's love of such a nature that it would entail him just allowing anybody who wants to enter into a relationship with him to do so?
Cortana, all I need to know is, did we lose them?
I think we both know the answer to that.
Yes.
Can God reveal himself to me in such a way that it is obvious and undeniable that he is in fact God?
Yes, but...
What? No, but. The follow-up question is, you've now claimed that God exists, God wants me to know exists, and God is capable of revealing himself to me in a way that is undeniable. Why hasn't it happened?
Because sin is interfering between you and God.
No. God can overcome sin, right? You've already said God can reveal himself to me in a way that it is undeniable. Do you realize that I walked down the aisle at the age of 5 and was a sincere believer in God for most of my early life, all the way up until the age of 30 or so? Yes. Okay, so you also said that God can God reveal himself to a hardened sinner in such a way that that sinner cannot deny that it happened?
Possibly.
No, not possibly. I want to know. So you think it's possible for God to do that, right? So now we're back to why hasn't it happened? You don't get to come up with post hoc and say, well, you're just a sinner or you'll just deny it. You've already acknowledged that God can do that. So the question is, why won't he, or why hasn't he?
Because he's waiting for you to repent and to come.
Until he reveals that he exists, I'm not going to repent. And even if he does reveal that he exists, I'm probably not going to repent. But you're making excuses now for why God won't do it. And what I said in my argument that you objected to was that either God doesn't exist or God doesn't want me to know he exists yet, which is clearly what's happening. In your excuse, God's waiting for me to do something before he'll reveal that he exists. So what you're saying is that I need to believe first, then take an action, and then God will reveal himself to me. The problem is I used to believe and I did take that action, and there's still been no revelation from God. So you, sir, are completely wrong. Quit making excuses for your God and actually understand that this is the case, that God hasn't revealed himself.
Yeah, well, even as a theist, I quite easily fall into that boat. I'm a fairly skeptical person, and I wouldn't come to believe in an absent and hidden God on faith alone. But then the other guy, he interrupts.
I have a question for you, Matt. Does Jesus or God reveal himself to sinners in the Bible? I feel like I remember that. I don't know the Bible as well as you. I feel like that happened once or twice.
All the time, but Jesus was alive then and walking around according to the Bible.
So, I mean, he can reveal himself to sinners too.
Oh, well, John already agreed that
Yeah, I mean,
Jesus
yeah.
could reveal himself.
No,
So I've gotten nasty responses from skeptics at times when I bring up Jesus Christ in conversations. But in the Bible, Jesus tells the people that he is God. He even performs miracles and acts of service. And the people, they still end up rejecting him. I've seen reluctant people come to believe in God themselves after having supernatural experiences. But for others, it's a waste of time. A lot of people will say they just don't care, or they just want to live their lives. I remember a few years back, I worked at the self-checkout area at Walmart, and we'd catch people shoplifting all the time. From a business standpoint, putting high-definition cameras in every single aisle did not deter shoplifters. And then for me, citing my sources on a Bible issue once caused a person to completely back out of the conversation altogether. Yeah, so another argument against God deals with just inaccuracies and contradictions in the Bible. You know, atheists will often laugh at theists who try to quote from their scriptures, their religious texts, because the scriptures, the religious texts, just have no power on an atheist. We already know that that's false.
In high school, I was a fundamentalist Christian. I believed that the Bible was inerrant. I believed in every single word. I believed everything was literal. I was a young earth creationist. And when I got to school, I started studying the Bible.
The Judeo-Christian Bible, for example, contains many accounts that are hard to swallow and then easy to pick on. You know, Jesus' ministry is depicted in the Bible as being controversial, and many of your skeptics today do not regard the Bible as truth. It's full of errors and contradictions, or it's no more spectacular than any other religious work at the time.
I've studied the Bible and philosophy and science for the past 3 years, and the second year we did nothing but read the Bible in Hebrew. You can look at the different manuscripts that we have. We have the Sumerian Pentateuch, the Dead Sea Scrolls, the Masoretic texts, and the thing is, they say different things. They have different words in different spots. They have different grammatical constructions in different spots. And so you can try to say, oh, well, the text is 99% accurate. But that means that the Bible is errant. The Bible does contain errors. It is not the inerrant word of God. And this created a major issue for me because if the Bible has errors, how do we know what's true and what's not true? You even run into that problem with the original language. So Hebrew was a dead language for quite a while, and then linguistic people ended up reviving the language. The issue is that we can't go back and know what was truly intended to be said in the Old Testament and the Hebrew there. They use metaphors and similes and things that we just can't quite understand. So then the question becomes, well, why did the all-powerful, all-knowing God of the universe not preserve the text that's supposed to reveal his plan and who he is? And then you can even look at how the Bible is similar to texts around the culture that was written around a similar time or even written earlier than the Bible. And it seems like the Bible is just really another text that was written in its time that was very similar to the cultures around it, and that there's really nothing special about it because...
Arguing from the standpoint of the testimonies in the Bible does nothing to convince the person. God has to physically show up.
Covenant, on the landing above us.
And so a lot of times I am accused of just focusing on the young earth creationists as if that's the only way I think it can be interpreted. I'm very much aware that that's not the case. Where I would push back though against someone like yourself would be if you're looking at Genesis and you're saying, okay, it's a lot more complicated. There's elements of it that are more poetic or they have metaphor or deeper meanings. I'm perfectly happy to accept that. But why then take the Bible and elevate it to a status above other works of literature at the time that share a lot of commonalities, whether it's, the Epic of Gilgamesh or the Sumerian flood myths and creation stories, the Egyptian creation stories, that if you spend a lot of time studying them, you'll find similar parallels or you'll find similar values. Why do you hold the Bible to a different standard? Or is there an outsider's test of faith where you can say the Bible really has something special, some secret sauce?
Well, I mean, I would simply say, well, the Genesis 1 to 11 is not the whole story. That's the beginning.
Mm-hmm.
And sure, if that was all we have, I don't know if I would be a Christian for sure. The reason I'm a Christian has more to do with New Testament themes, fulfillment of Christ, the resurrection, that kind of thing. I do think there is good evidence for the resurrection. I don't see that as a big issue because I just see them drawing from the same cultural river. Like they're going to be pulling things and understandings of things from their same background the same way we would.
Even if it's cultures that are completely isolated and that developed their myths and their cultural ideas centuries later, you might look at creation myths among Aztecs or among groups that are completely separate from each other, and they might still have similar, because human psychology is similar, they might have similar parallels.
So as I look at it, Jesus is probably the closest God argument that I can give. I'm not going to try to argue in favor of Vishnu or any of the Greek or Roman gods or anything like that. So in Matthew chapter 12, verses 38 through 45, Jesus says, "A wicked generation will beg for signs and wonders, but the only sign that will be given is the sign of Jonah." In the book of Jonah, miracles are performed, and Gentiles come to faith in the God of Israel. As Jesus is depicted as performing miracles, he is also depicted as gathering many followers to him, but also many enemies. I remember growing up, my church pastor, he grew up in an atheist household, which is pretty different. He ended up giving a sermon one time. He, as a church pastor, would go to the gym every week, and he would talk to different people. He'd end up bringing up his faith. So one week, he ended up talking to this Indian guy, and the two ended up getting in a bit of a discussion. Him and the Indian guy ended up deciding they were going to exchange books on their faith. So the Indian guy ended up giving him a book to read on the mind, where mind, body, spirit, Indian philosophy. My church pastor ended up giving the Indian guy a book, Lee Strobel's The Case for Christ, which talks about the death and resurrection of Jesus, and just a lot of details. And my pastor realized the discussions they were both going to have after reading the books were going to be very different. Another argument against God deals with morality and our moral framework. People who go and criticize morality will just say that our moral values are not quite the same from culture to culture. So you've got all these different cultures like India, for example, and China, and Europe, and the United States, and South America, and there's just all these little differences in culture. But the point when we really come in conflict is each generation forms its own moral values, this concept of right and wrong. And when people talk about the Bible, for example, they get a little bit offended. They say, oh, God is just too cruel. You have Moses delivering the 10 Commandments to his people, where he tells the people they shouldn't murder, they shouldn't steal, they should honor God. They should honor their parents. They shouldn't act sexually. So nobody can follow those commandments. This is ridiculous.
We're going to be talking about the laws, not just the 10 Commandments, but you get all these other laws that people cite today for moral reasons. I mean, it's the basis of Christianity. And as you know, people will still cherry pick laws from the Old Testament. They'll pick a law and they say, this shows that this is immoral. And then you look at the next verse in the same law, it's an abomination for a man to lay with another man. It's absolutely stated in the book of Leviticus. And so you can't do that. And, then it says, you're not to wear a garment made of two different kinds of thread. They just, oh, God, okay. Nope, no more. Get rid of your sweaters. You got polyester and cotton. No, not allowed. Sorry. No, but you take one of them, you don't take the other one. In what sense did these things happen? In what sense are they teaching important moral lessons, whether we accept the morality or not? What are they trying to teach, quite apart from what actually happened? And then the question, I'm not going to tell people what's relevant for them or not, but I'm going to say, these are some issues you need to think about if you're claiming that these are relevant, and I'm not taking a stand per se on relevance, but I'm saying, these are the considerations you need to bring into account.
Mm-hmm. It's so interesting. It's very similar to I suppose it's across all of the books. You have the same problem as the Ten Commandments, which is that people will hyper-focus on one or two, not really knowing the rest of the rules that they would also need to be following if it was all,
Right. Some things are forbidden, and but I'm going to go eat this is forbidden. You're immoral if you do this. But do you have any more ham?
Yeah, exactly.
Oh, well, that doesn't apply to us. Well, why does, how do you decide?
There's that little contradictory phase at one point in the Bible where God says, "You shall not murder." And then when the Hebrew people are facing off against the Canaanites, God says, "Go in there and just wipe them all out. Don't leave anyone left standing." So sometimes people will criticize God and say, God, if he's real, if he exists, he's just very contradictory at times in his morality, in his moral code. Another thing that can happen is just culture shock. The culture changes every 5 to 10 years. When I was in school, for example, in the late 90s and through the 2000s pretty much, cell phones were not popular. You couldn't have a cell phone in school. But now everybody's on their cell phone constantly. I did a video in college where these guys were all walking down the street and they're all looking down on their cell phones while they're walking. And they're just so connected, but they're also so disconnected. So a friend of mine looked at it. We have our convictions, our inner sense of right and wrong, but then we can also override our convictions. And so you have this fluid morality from generation to generation just because of culture. The culture is ever changing, ever evolving. It's not just set in stone from one generation to the next. Another one I look at is racism. There's always been racism, but even in the United States, some of my relatives are Italian, and they had the Italian problem. They couldn't get fired from their jobs, but their jobs could prevent them from getting a promotion. Racism against people of color, black people. Up until I think the 1950s at least, there were still segregated schools across the country. There were schools that were completely all black and then completely all white. And it was illegal for a black person to try to go to a white school. And that was normal for my grandparents probably, and my great-grandparents, their generation. But now we look at that and we see that, we know that that is wrong. And people back then knew that that was wrong too, but they had just overridden whatever convictions that they had, and they went along with the trending culture. We still have racism today, of course. At the time of Jesus, at least, there were the Roman gladiatorial games, the Colosseum games, and they were just very violent, very bloody, very realistic. And as people became followers of Jesus, suddenly people stopped wanting to watch the gladiatorial games. They realized that the gladiatorial games were wrong. And so because of this Judeo-Christian worldview that the people were adopting, it was starting to change their outlook on life and what they found to be acceptable. Where our morality is shifting very quickly, or our family structure is shifting very quickly, and we're not quite sure how to keep up with all of this. You know what else is good argument against God? Candy corn. It gets thrown out window, comrade. Another argument against God is, which one? Atheists will often point out that there's just many religions out there, and each of those religions has their own deities, and they can't all be true.
It was kind of around that time where I started to think about these things. Well, who's right? There's so many different opinions, and then not only that, but then there's almost like different religions, right? So you've got Christianity, and then inside Christianity, you've got all these different types of Christianity. And then, you move outside of that, and then you've got, like Jehovah's Witness, which is kind of based on the same principles, but it's clearly a different thing than normal Christianity. And then you've got Seventh-day Adventists or Mormons. And then sort of moving from there, you have Judaism, which they kind of reject the New Testament, but they use the same Old Testament as the Christians. And then from there, you've got this sort of Abrahamic God. And then Muslims also believe in that same God, and they actually accept, the core teachings of the Old Testament up to a certain point. So you've got Judaism and Islam using the same teachings, but coming to drastic different conclusions. And then you've got Christians coming to all these different conclusions.
Hinduism, the religion of over 1 billion people. Hinduism is the world's oldest active religion. Hinduism has been around for so long that it and the concept of India itself are inseparable. Hindus are a diverse group. Some are strict, dedicating their lives to prayer, while others don't believe in any gods but still follow Hindu philosophy. Hindus believe in a universal soul known as Brahman. Brahman is the universe and the material that makes up the universe. Actions of the soul while in a body have effects on that soul's next life. When you die, your soul moves to another new body. This is called transmigration. The goal in Hindu life is to somehow get back to Brahman. If a Hindu can do this, they will be freed from the cycle of life and death. This is called moksha. Unlike Christianity or Islam, Hinduism is a non-profit organization. There is no Jesus or Muhammad for Hindus. There is no Bible, Quran, or Torah. Instead, they have a bunch, and I mean a bunch, of different sacred texts. But even though everything comes from Brahman, who is the one real thing in Hinduism, Hindus do, after all, have thousands of gods. First, there's Brahma, the creator. He created everything in the universe, but he is not the universe itself. Vishnu, the preserver, is the second member of the Hindu trinity. He preserves the world created by Brahma until it is eventually destroyed by Shiva.
No, James. Change the subject. It is too confusing. With many people, they grow up in a home without faith being taught, and so faith and God are both somewhat of a strange idea. These people struggle to relate to faith practices. I was a lot like that. I went to church like a couple times as a kid, really, but as I started coming to church youth group, I wasn't saved, I wasn't a believer. And so a lot of the stuff they were talking about in church youth group was just very strange to me. There was no difference to me whether they were worshiping God or worshiping a figment of their imagination. It's just very easy to scoff at something we don't know. It's very easy to criticize a belief that we just don't understand. And not only that, people have often used their faith and the Bible to try to fit their agenda. Or many of your gods no longer even have followers anymore. The Greek gods and the Roman gods, nobody even worships them anymore. It's been quite a while. And so many of your atheists will single out the Christian God, and they'll say how society has just done away with every other lame, false god, and they've just got one more god left to go.
The fact that you and I could improve the Bible with very little thought, if we just took out the worst passages that have no possible redeemable content this year, or I would argue any other year, the Bible's already improved, right? So the fact that we could edit it to anyone's advantage is a problem for the idea that this was written by an omniscient being and not to be superseded by any human effort now or generations from now. This is a problem not just for the Bible, it's a problem for the Quran. That and this notion of revelation is what gets us there. Now, if you're going to treat all books as the product of just human minds, brilliant or not, and every shelf in the bookstore or library has the same status with respect to the merely mortal provenance of these ideas, then it's fine. Then you can pick and choose the best ideas, right? And then you can be slavishly attached to the Plato's Republic, and that can be your favorite book. But what Revelation gets you is this notion that no, this isn't just a book, right? This is the product of omniscience on some level, and that ties your hands intellectually, because then you are forced to make these acrobatic contortions around passages which clearly have no good application now and didn't even have a good application then. And when you view it from the other side, when you think about just how good a book would be if an omniscient being wrote it, I mean, that is it's very easy to see what could be in there that would still astonish us. I mean, it's very easy to see what could be in there that would prove, just based on the time of its emergence, that this couldn't have been the product of merely human minds. And there's nothing like that in the Bible.
Yeah, that's right. We're coming for you, Yeshua. Wait, do aliens exist? Alright, so why would aliens be an argument against God? So, most religions put humanity, people, as the center of it all. We are the ones who God created, and we are the ones that God focuses on. If aliens came about, they may not know anything about our God, our faith. They may have their own faith, they may be very hostile, they may have better technology, they may know things about the universe that we completely don't know. And so overall, atheists would focus on aliens as a possible argument against God, because the presence of life on other planets and the presence of aliens would diminish us. It would prove that we're not the center of the universe. We're nothing special. Look at this. You've got microbes on Mars. You've got all these planets in the galaxy and the solar system that have life. So life on Earth is nothing. It's nothing. It's not significant. We're just another fish in the sea. We're just the byproduct of evolution and all these natural processes. So in a TED Talk, scientist Stephen Webb looks at the possibility of discovering alien life in the universe. He says so far, we really haven't found anything, and it's quite puzzling. So Webb looks at the search for alien life
in terms of the barriers that would need to be cleared if a planet is to host a communicative civilization.
As Webb describes it, there are potentially trillions of galaxies and planets across the visible universe, and our universe is ancient. Most of those planets are probably not going to become habitable or be able to produce life and support life. He says the right elements are out there in outer space, but the elements have to fall under the right circumstances in order to be effective and create anything. Even if a planet does produce life from the dead vacuum of space, it may not ever become advanced, intelligent life, and that's what scientists are specifically looking for. And then from there, there's even barriers in terms of what it would take for an alien civilization to reach us, to make contact with us. So in the search for extraterrestrial life, there is just barrier after barrier. And in the end, Webb says,
there's an obvious answer. We're alone. It's just us.
So far, we've never really found any intelligent life in the universe, in our galaxy, besides us. We're so far the most advanced thing that we can find. Even though there are other planets out there, there are other stars, there's other planets, there's other galaxies, there's an infinite number of possibilities. If there are aliens out there, one, they don't want to communicate with us. They think it's just too dangerous to try to communicate with us. Another thing that could happen is they may not have the same level of technology as us. If there's an alien, it may just be basic animals living on a planet somewhere. Or it could be like cavemen or something. The second thing is life on other planets may not be in existence at the same time as we are. So we could have a really powerful, intelligent civilization come about and then go extinct. And then we come about maybe a billion years later or something. So we don't coexist with other races. And the last one that I look at is if they do exist at the same time as us, it may just be too much of a hardship for us to reach them or for them to reach us. It could take trillions of years to reach the other civilization. They may not have the technology to reach us, and if they did have the technology to reach us, we could make them very sick. Life on Earth may not be hospitable to them, and life on their planet may not be hospitable to us. And we may have diseases that we could infect each other with. Or aliens would have no reason to come here because all the precious resources we have on Earth are abundant out in outer space. So the aliens would go to the resources in outer space before they would ever try to come here for resources. Therefore, we would basically be irrelevant to them unless they really wanted to try to, colonize Earth or something. Hey, it's possible. I didn't say it was going to be easy. So, one of the latest emerging arguments against God deals with science and new scientific discoveries. It's arguable to say that many of your faith groups have theology and creation accounts that, when taken literally, do not always fit well with new scientific discoveries.
Problem, isn't it? We have two competing theories as to how the world came into existence.
Well, I think the point is, I really object when it's two competing theories. One, a scientific theory is falsifiable, it's testable. God isn't testable. I can't disprove the existence of God. I can't disprove the possibility that we all were created 3 seconds ago with the memories of this delightful conversation we've had. So the point is that
we can
putting
play you
science
back the tape later.
putting science and religion as if they're competing theories does a disservice to science, because science, you can
That's
say
not
that,
what you're hearing from me, though, is it?
Well, no, it is, because you're saying that explains the world to you. It doesn't. Christianity doesn't explain how airplanes fly or how. And the bait and switch that worried me is when you say, all of this provides clear evidence that there's intelligence or design. The point is, the universe behaves, but the universe, if you look at it, it behaves as if there's no purpose to the universe. Now, does that prove there's no purpose? Absolutely not. But a universe that behaves without purpose, and a universe created by God to look like a universe without purpose, well, they might as well be the same to me. It makes God irrelevant.
Sometimes science and religion disagree with each other. Or the most common argument is, we're just not sure why this works the way it does, but let's leave God out of it. No, I think that's the safest bet. Or faith and science become fear words. You know, faith is not real. Science is not real.
Harold actually asked the question, I think you were saying, did the laws of physics equally spring from nothing, fully formed, into existence from nothing?
What is surprising is that the conventional wisdom right now, which could be wrong, and that's the other nice thing about science, we don't mind being wrong and changing our minds, unlike religion, but is that in fact, because of discovering that empty space has energy, it seems quite plausible that our universe may be just one universe in what could be almost an infinite number of universes, and in every universe the laws of physics are different, and they come into existence when the universe comes into existence. So our laws of physics may become, God forbid, forgive me for saying that, could just environmental science.
Could some of those universes have gods creating them?
No, because the point is that, you know, when people say that you need a God to create a universe, you need intelligence to create a universe, then the key question, of course, is, well, if God is more complex than the universe, then how could God come into existence?
Wow, that's a big one. So science and atheism really seem to go hand in hand.